We have about 400 plus contributors coming from global market in this community. And I think it's due to the core problem we are trying to resolve, right? Where the scaling is a big pain, the database are able to resolve it. And we see a lot of customer actually, or contributors coming from Asia Pacific region. As you may know pretty well, in this market, the data volume has been increasing crazily, and mobile first adoptions has been also very different to the Western markets. And we see a lot of architects, backend engineers, database administrators has been involved into the community from this part of the world, Asia Pacific, working very actively on the open source project for TiDB.
This is your host, Oscar Ramos, and you are listening to the Asia Startup Pulse podcast, your looking glass into the Asian investment and startup ecosystem. Hosted by the Global Venture Capital Fund, SOSB, and its cross-border accelerators, Chan Accelerator and MOX. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Asia Startup Pulse, and today our guest is Neil Han, Head of Asia Pacific and EMEA at PingCap. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Oscar, nice to come here.
PingCap is an open source unicorn. They raised over 350 million in funding, and the team led the development of TiDB, the world's leading distributed SQL database for elastic scale and real-time analytics, which is compatible with one of the most popular databases out there, MySQL. The TiDB enables companies to scale their business while keeping the underlying infrastructure simple, serving as a one-stop solution for online transactions analysis. Neil is a hardcore software guy. He's built his career over the software world, consulting with CIOs, CTOs, and engineering teams to help them always improve their data architecture and their product strategy. He started as the first commercial team member in Asia Pacific for PingCap. But before that, he also worked helping Twilio launch in Asia Pacific and scaling their revenue 30 times in 4 years. Before that, he also worked in multiple software companies from around the world. Neil, before we start talking more about the open source ecosystem, let's try to understand a bit more about PingCap. PingCap is a database, distributed database. What makes PingCap special?
PingCap really started in a very interested ecosystem where at that time, 6 years ago, we were looking into the three co-founders were looking into the database ecosystems and see what's going on, right? So basically there are trends where the data volume has been increased year by year exponentially. And the hardwares and the more loss, right, is not really effective anymore. Where you see the machines can't keep up with the speed of development of internet and data scale. And that's where during that time, right, Google actually had the F1 and Spanner paper published. And the whole thing inspired the three co-founders. Well, at that time, they were infrastructure engineers to look into what they can do with the current situations, because on one hand, there's quite a lot of data administrators in their company to maintain the databases, which is complex. On the other hand, there are new architecture coming, and seems that's the architecture resolve the current, at that time, a dilemma of scaling and also the machine development. So that's where PingCap, the TiDB, the core product, has been born. 6 years ago, the company was founded, and we open sourced the database from the day one to the global market. And we want to see whether this message and the problem we are trying to tackle is well received or not. And that's where TiDB was developed. Along the 6 years, right, we have been seeing tremendous adoption in the industry. And if you look at one of the parameters we look at open source, right, is the stars on GitHub. We see we have about 20,000 stars along the GitHub. And that's actually one of the most start projects at GitHub in terms of databases. And apparently it's well received. And the issue we were trying to resolve is really a pinpoint for developers, back engineers, and also database administrators. So that's how PingCap has been working on TiDB and how TiDB has been adopted by the industry and technologists.
What type of organizations, what type of services leverage the value of PingCap?
It all comes back to initially what kind of problems we want to resolve, right? Where we see companies are trying to scale their services, but it's hard to scale because traditionally, if you are working on a MySQL databases, you have to do, when the data at a certain scale, for example, 1 terabyte data, that's where you have to hire a bunch of engineers, especially the database administrators, to keep up with the data scaling. And it's not a few days time, it's many months time together with like about, 10 database administrators to manage that scaling. And with TiDB, right, they don't need that many people and that amount of time anymore. Few days time, port over the data to TiDB, and engineers like or two are able to work at the scale of 800 terabyte data amount of volumes. That's in the past, no way can resolve. Along the line, we see customer excited about what we can deliver, and also they're asking more, right? That's the beauty of being part of this community, where we get the firsthand input from the users and customers. And one of the ask is like, I have the data based on your database, right? Why can't I do more? For example, now I have been using for transactional processing, which is basically, for example, you place the order to an e-commerce website, that placement of the order is actually one transaction. And now I want to analyze what's going on with the users using my services. And that's kind of a real-time insight of data analytics. Again, right, in the past, there's no such thing existing. People have to, or database administrators have to move the data to another databases for analysis because they don't want the analysis impact the transactions, right? Because you don't want the people on one hand analyzing tons of data, pulling the data around. Because when you do that at the one databases, it will impact the users on using the transactional databases, right? And our users basically asking us, can't you do it in one databases? Due to the architecture of how we architected in day one, right? We are actually able to do that. Definitely, it takes a lot of engineering effort to get there, but nowadays we can easily declare we are one of the leading company are able to do both transactional and analytical processing all together in one database. And to a simple word, it's called HTAB.
This might be something that potentially can be surprising for a lot of people. You're an open source company. The software, the source code, not only your software is freely available, the source of your code is actually available for anyone that wants to download, compile, modify, redistribute. At the same time, even if you're giving away your product, you not only were able to funding to build a business, you actually raised a significant amount of funding. What's the business model behind PingCap? How do you make money?
I would say it's not a really a dramatic innovation for the business model. Open source has been there for many years, and especially for the software infrastructure projects, for example, Linux, for example, our pioneers for open source MySQL, right? It's been there for a long time. We basically also a believer in order to make such kind of infrastructure software to be successful, we need to be open source. And as a matter of fact, before this project, right, the co-founders has been working on another open source project before this one, where they were trying to do a distributed Codis, another very popular memory database at that time called Codis, based on the Redis open source project. They see tremendous adoption from that project too, right? Then make them believe even further this is something we have to do. And along the 6 years development, it's been definitely a proof the believer on the open source kind of payout, where we got customers and users really globally, not only from one or two specific countries or regions, but really globally. And the model also is kind of as common as what other open source company has been working on, where we provide all the open source code to the communities, users and customers even are free to download the open source. Every piece of source code is available on GitHub. And they basically try it out before talking to us. At the same time, once they are at a certain stage of ready for deployment or production, that's the time they actually talk to us because database is one of the core asset of companies, whether you are doing that on the analytical processing or transactional processing. The team take a big responsibility to make sure the service they deploy is available. And to get there, they need to learn the technology, but at the same time, they want the expert who build the databases helping them. And that's where PingCAP comes in. And we are the company build this TidyB and know TidyB in and out from day one. And also we own the roadmap of TidyB. Oh, absolutely. The industry has been evolving, right? It can't be set stone because currently the open source ecosystem does kind of have a little bit trend, and investors are also trying to pick up what's happening for open source because it seems a lot of companies have been doing pretty well. And I believe there's another trend comes in with all the cloud infrastructure company has been developing, and also a lot of companies has been working on software as a service or platform as a service. That's where the cloud come into, and I would say the cloud and the SaaS platform or PaaS platform, whatever you call, are accelerators of the open source company to be commercialized compared to the simple model in the past on the license or subscription based for the license. Right now we have another model, which is the SaaS platform or software as a service platform.
So on one side, you have the SaaS, software as a service, platform as a service model where your users will be able to simply avoid having to deploy their own infrastructure themselves and then just use it from your own service, or potentially there's a layer of professional services that you can offer to develop your company. But at the same time, you also have a very active community. On the database companies, at least in this space of distributed SQL databases, you have one relatively large, one of the largest communities. Where is your community of contributors coming from? Where are the areas where PingCAP and TidyB have the most supporters?
Yeah, so far, as I mentioned before, we have about 400 plus contributors coming from global market in this community. And I think it's due to the core problem we are trying to resolve, right? Where the scaling is a big pain, the database are able to resolve it. And we see a lot of customer actually, or contributors coming from Asia Pacific region. As you may know pretty well, in this market, the data volume has been increasingly crazily, and mobile first adoptions has been also very different to the Western markets. And we see a lot of architects, backend engineers, database administrators has been involved into the community from this part of the world, Asia Pacific, working very actively on the open source project for TidyB. And by working with them very closely, we are able to develop our technology further to fulfill their need. And their profile is very similar. And the other ones on the daily basis to solve the database scaling problems on their companies. And because that's the big pain and the big target for them, right? We really get to know what are the needs. And we are fortunate enough to work with them and also beta test our product in the field with them, because Asia Pacific has been growing so tremendously, and we basically grew with them together. And in the other region, it's gonna be tough, I feel, where you see customer has been growing the data set from like a few terabyte data to 100 of terabyte data, sometimes 1 terabyte data in a few months time. And that's the scale I'm talking about. So the other ones, we work closely to beta test the database.
We hope you're enjoying the episode, and if you're an entrepreneur building a cross-border business, feel free to contact us at chinaaccelerator.com or mobileonlyx.com. So you have a network of contributors from the Asia Pacific region, and I'm assuming that there's also an relative overlap between what your community is and your customers are. You were talking about how the region is seeing an explosion of data with a more personalized, mobile-first type of interaction with services and a very prevalent presence during the whole day with a lot of multiple touch points, also including this super app concept where a single company has an app that integrates multiple services that basically can fulfill the needs of a user during the whole day. Who are your customers? Who are your largest customers right now?
Well, it's hard to define the largest customers. Maybe we can talk about the few of the largest users or customers has been using the database at a very large scale. And that's where we see customer it's really distributed pretty well. Customer users like Shopee from Singapore. They are covering Southeast Asia on the e-commerce places. We have also Book My Show, the largest ticketing booking systems in India, and PayPay from Japan, for example. They are the largest QR payment company based in Japan. And also in China, specifically, we have also a lot of users because that's a region they are a few steps advanced in terms of the consumer-facing apps and all these innovations, right? Where we see users, customers like Xiaomi, like Xiaohongshu, or sometimes we are joking, like if you open the WeChat apps, if ever you use it, there's 9 applications on the app page. Among of 9, right, there are 8 applications has been using TidyB for their core transactional or database analysis. And that's amazing achievement for the database like TidyB only in a 6 years time.
Yeah, definitely. The type of customers you're talking about and the type of usage is definitely very, very, very intense. So I think that's a good evidence of the potential strength. I think that one of the questions that might be surprising is still there's a lot of stigma, like Chinese companies not paying for software. Yet you mentioned quite relevant large companies that you have as customers in China. What has been your experience selling your services and your products to Chinese companies?
Well, I wouldn't blame anyone not paying the service because that's the purpose of open source, right? If the developers and customers or users are able to pay up and use the technology, we are more than welcome. Is growing, and because that's what the open source purpose for, right? And we are in a position is really to help customers or users if they need the help. Because database on a core transactional core business is not a small things to work on. And it takes a lot of effort and quality of expertise to really have that expertise for their deployment of production environment. We actually embrace that community who has been really enjoy using the open source edition. That's where we engage with companies, whether they are paid or not paid, to bring them into the community. If they are interested to work with us for some of the core development, we're more than come to work with them. We don't need to at a certain scale, and we definitely strategic work with some of the open source community contributors to work on certain projects. That's where we sign some partnerships with those companies, right? But in general, I see we are the ones to help. And we have done a lot of conferences, workshops to educate them, no matter whether they are users or customers. And we receive a lot of feedback from our users and customers on both sides from different angles. We take it as a very positive sign for us. Communities are, I think, the root of growth. We have to make sure the community success and thrive first. before we talk about any commercial success, right? And that's our guidelines for the open source and the principles for the community. So along the way, we have been helping customers too, where they come manage the open source community edition. And we come in to help them, guide them, provide the professional guidelines, best practices, how to, for example, migrate the data, scale the data, and maintain their own infrastructures or onto the cloud, or even use our hosted services. Because if you are a small team, maintaining a database definitely is painful. Even though we have been resolving a very good architecture, but still take time and effort, right? If you do a kind of TCO, kind of ownership cost calculations, the one hosted by third parties, for example, by PingCap, is more cost efficient. So we help them on either professional service or technical support to their own deployment or by our own cloud as service to really help them scale. End of the day, we want this open source project to be successful. And that's twofold. One is community growing, and the other one is commercial successful for us so that we can come back to maintain the TidyB further on the development of open source projects. And that's, I would say, flywheel for us to make sure the open source project gonna sustain and growing. And that's actually always what our users has been asking. And also that's one of the parameters actually they measure and consider whether they're gonna adopt this open source product or not. So basically based on the stars, based on the adoptions, based on the funding even, how much fund we have to sustain the project. And we are glad we are so far the most valued distributed SQL databases in the market.
Good. So basically, the key here is to really bring in value beyond an existing product that can be monetized with a license. I mean, you mentioned that you have contributors. Are your major clients also contributing to the core of TIDB?
Yeah, they do actually. So take one customer, for example, Square. They have been our users for a long time. And their team, because their team has been really working on multiple projects, and we know definitely we have our core roadmap we have to keep up because that's our promise to our users and customers in general. But they also have their own roadmap, right? And for their own roadmap, they have different tools they're gonna use, and they have different initiatives they're gonna go. With open source, right? They are now able to contribute the work they have done and to the open source repository. And now they are able to enjoy that piece of new development from their team at the same time, because they are not the only company maybe working on that initiative, right? And they are now able to enjoy working with a community of users who are working on the same initiative to drive development of that specific or few features. And that's what we see has been really benefiting. And there are a lot of features developed by our community users like Square. And we have been really enjoying that initiatives, no matter they are paid or not paid customers or users. And we see both sides has been contributing a lot to the source code.
We're talking about databases. We're talking about core systems for companies.
So that's a big question, like how we are able to adapt to these database ecosystems. I think because the database is that core strength, right? And there are two kind of, there are multiple type of users has been really using TidyB. Just give you two maybe extreme examples. One is the ones who are the internet companies, and they have been building the service. They don't have amount of resources or the budget to pay paid services, right? That's where they start with the open source product and scale with their team and their business. So when they scale, it kind of go dramatically scaling. And that's where from day one, they choose TidyB, and we are able to resolve at least on the database scaling perspective. There are another type of users or customers who are from the enterprises where we see the trend also changing. And there are users and the customers in the enterprises, for example, big banks, in the government agent, they are currently also choosing open source database more than anything else because what open source are able to provide in terms of the transparency of what we are doing on the database side, in terms of the flexibility for the team to manage their own roadmap with the open source product working on, like what I mentioned, Square. They are able to do their own things based on their own roadmap with open source. And also, because of all this development, right, we have been enjoying the growth of our own user base. And that, again, right, contribute back to the maturity of this technology. And we see so many commits, so many pull requests. That's a term of open source from the community. And we literally have a committee of source code reviewing to make sure the feature requests and pull requests are able to be served quickly enough so that we can pick up the most useful features and contributions from the community to back to the main source code of TiDB. And we see this whole thing has been really accelerated. If we are not open source, I don't think we are able to enjoy such kind of vibrant and ideas or even source code from the community.
Beyond the application of open source in databases, and more specifically in Asia, where you work with a lot of CIOs, you work with a lot of technology companies, what are the other areas where you see open source growing in the Asia Pacific region?
Well, I would say it's changing in multiple industries. In my past, because I also work as a software developer and engineering manager before, right? At that time, we were not really prioritizing open source as one of the core initiatives from engineering teams to work on it. But now we see multiple industry has been changing that way of adoption. I think the most dramatical one, as I mentioned, are from financial industries, from the government sectors. In the past, they are afraid of choosing this kind of open source projects because you are not as expert on this and you have to work on it and maintain it. And you need a team of experts to really work on such kind of technologies. But we see this has been really changing. Open source has been one of the benchmark or parameters they think about when they choose new technologies. I would say kind of contribute back to what I talked about on the benefit of using open source, right? Where you own your own roadmap, where you own your own kind of your own source code, because you don't need to rely on any vendor for the features you're going to requesting, for the budgeting you're going to work out, because now you are free to really choose multiple platforms to deploy to, either on public cloud or your own premises or your own infrastructure. And we even have customer users, because they have been working so well internally to their internal team to provide this database. And now they are more aggressive. They want to provide this internal database as a service to a public-facing database as a service built on top of TiDB. That's really very different now. And that, again, right, really kudos to the open source. And now the user's customer are able to do it. But in the past, if you use other vendors' solution, you can never do that. And because of that, right, we see the business model and the way of thinking about open source has been changing. And now certain customers, certain sectors are thinking of this technology development being a revenue, not a cost, and being an innovation, not a burden for the company to move on. Especially the company focus a lot technology building, or focus a lot on they want to listen to their customer, what they are asking, And with the requirement they collect from their customers, now they know what kind of features they want to work on. And with open source, they are basically able to map those features back to the backend open source projects, for example, TiDB, right? To work on certain features that as a company, for example, PingCap may not be focused on because it's open source. They are flexible enough to do it.
Well, thank you very much, Neil, for sharing all your insights, not only about PingCap, but also about the current state-of-the-art of open source in each specific, the opportunities for open source companies in the region. If anybody is interested in learning more about PingCap because they are interested in the services or because they want to contribute, what is the best way to reach out to you?
There are two ways. One is if you are interested about the technology itself, go on to GitHub, search TiDB, you will see the one on the top. And there's another way is we have a community of users and customers where you can come to our website, pingcap.com, pingcap.com, where there's a Slack channel for community where you can mingle with each others. And definitely if you are interested on more like for us to help professionally, you can always hit the button of contact us. And to reach out to us, we will have people from our team reach out to you.
Thank you for joining today in the podcast.
Well, thank you, Oscar, for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Like, share, and subscribe to the Asia Startup Pulse podcast and sign up to our newsletter to never miss another episode.